Here's what they didn't tell you on the front page. Here's what got buried under the noise of the daily churn, the stock tickers, the press briefings, the manufactured outrage of the week. While Washington was busy arguing about itself, Canada just made a move, a quiet, methodical, absolutely enormous move that could fundamentally alter the balance of economic power between two countries that have shared the longest undefended border in the world for over a century. And the United States, at this particular moment in history, may have almost no answer for it. $2 trillion. Let that land for a second. Not $2 billion, not $200 billion. $2 trillion. That is the estimated value of Canada's potash reserves, the single largest concentration of this mineral on the face of the earth. And Canada has just signaled, in terms that are impossible to misread if you're paying attention, that it is prepared to use that resource as a geopolitical and economic weapon, not metaphorically, not rhetorically, as an actual coordinated strategic instrument of national policy. And if you think you know where this story goes, I promise you, you do not yet. So let's start with what potash actually is, because I think a lot of people hear that word and their eyes glaze over and they move on. And that is exactly the reaction that has allowed this story to develop in the shadows for as long as it has. Potash is potassium. And potassium, in the context of modern industrial agriculture, is not optional. It is not a supplement. It is not a nice to have. It is one of the three foundational nutrients, alongside nitrogen and phosphorus, without which you cannot grow food at scale. Full stop. No potash, no modern crop yields. No modern crop yields, no feeding 8 billion people on this planet. It is, in the most literal and unromantic sense of the phrase, the mineral that keeps the world alive. And Canada has roughly 30% of the entire planet's known reserves of it, sitting mostly under the province of Saskatchewan in deposits so vast and so rich that geologists who study this stuff describe them in almost reverent terms. The kind of reserves that if you were designing a country from scratch and you wanted to give it permanent generational leverage over the global food supply chain, you would draw exactly this map. Canada didn't choose this. The geology chose it for them. But here's the thing about geopolitical leverage. It doesn't matter how you got it. It only matters whether you're willing to use it. And for most of the past century, Canada wasn't, not really. The relationship between Canada and the United States has been, in the bluntest terms, one of comfortable asymmetry. The United States is 10 times Canada's population, roughly 10 times its GDP, and has historically operated with the quiet assumption, rarely stated but always present, that Canada is, in the most affectionate possible way, a junior partner, a reliable neighbor, a country that shares your values, your border, your hockey rivalries, and whose foreign policy tends to rhyme with yours, even when it doesn't match. That was the operating assumption for decades. It shaped trade deals. It shaped defense arrangements. It shaped the entire psychological architecture of the bilateral relationship. That assumption is now being stress tested in ways that should make every serious policymaker in Washington deeply uncomfortable. And not because Canada has suddenly become hostile, not because something dramatic happened overnight, but because a very specific combination of forces, economic pressure, political recalibration, and the unmistakable signal being sent by the current direction of American trade and foreign policy, has pushed Canada to do something it has never really done before. It has started thinking about its leverage systematically, deliberately, out loud. The Potash move is the clearest expression of that shift. And when I say move, I want to be precise, because this is not one single announcement or one piece of legislation. It is a coordinated strategic posture, a series of policy signals, investment decisions, diplomatic positioning, and resource management choices that, taken together, add up to something that the United States has not faced from Canada in living memory. A neighbor that is calmly, professionally, and with considerable sophistication beginning to play its hand. Think about the timing for a moment, because timing in geopolitics is never accidental. This is happening at a moment when the United States has voluntarily, enthusiastically, and with great fanfare been torching its relationships with its closest trading partners. Tariffs slapped on allies. Rhetoric that treats economic interdependence as weakness rather than strength. A posture that says, in effect, every relationship is a zero-sum transaction, and America intends to win every transaction. That posture has consequences. One of those consequences is sitting in Saskatchewan right now, and it is worth approximately $2 trillion. Because here is what Canada understands, and what Washington has apparently not fully processed. When you treat a partner like an adversary, you should not be surprised when they start acting like one, not an enemy. Canada is not about to become an enemy of the United States, and nothing about this story suggests that trajectory, but a strategic actor with its own interests, its own calculations, and its own willingness to leverage what it has. That is a different relationship than the one Washington thought it had. And adjusting to that reality, if Washington is even capable of adjusting to it right now, is going to require a level of strategic seriousness that has been conspicuously absent. Here's what I want you to understand before we go any further. This is not just a trade story. It is not just an agriculture story. It is not even just a Canada-US story, though it is all of those things. It is a story about what happens when the foundational assumptions of a geopolitical relationship collapse, and what the country that got too comfortable in that relationship is left holding when they do. And what the United States is left holding, in this particular case, is a problem with no quick fix, no obvious workaround, and no historical precedent for how to resolve it. Because we have never had to think about potash before. We have never had to think about what it means that the country next door controls 30% of the world's supply of something that keeps food on the table. We assumed we didn't have to think about it. We assumed the relationship was stable enough, durable enough, warm enough, that this was just a fact of geography and not a fact of power. Canada just reminded us, politely, as Canadians do, but unmistakably, that it is very much a fact of power. And the next question, the one we are going to spend the rest of this conversation digging into, is, what does Washington do now? Stay with me, because the history of how we got here is not what you think it is, and it is absolutely essential to understanding what comes next. For most of American history, the relationship with Canada has been treated less like foreign policy and more like domestic furniture, present, useful, occasionally bumped into, but never really examined. You don't think about the chair until it's gone. And the reason that framing matters, the reason it is essential context for everything we are about to get into, is that it explains with almost painful clarity how Washington consistently failed to see this moment coming. Not because the signals weren't there. They were there. They have been there for years. But when you have spent decades operating inside an assumption of permanent, unconditional, neighborly goodwill, you develop a kind of strategic blindness that is very difficult to correct, especially quickly, especially under pressure. Let me take you back, because the history here is deeper and stranger and more instructive than the current news cycle gives it credit for. The story of North American resource interdependence, the real story, not the sanitized trade agreement version, begins in the post-war period when the United States emerged from World War II as the undisputed center of economic gravity in the Western Hemisphere and, frankly, the world. The Bretton Woods system, the Marshall Plan, the explosion of American industrial and agricultural output, all of it created a set of interlocking dependencies that benefited the United States enormously and shaped the development trajectories of every country in its orbit, including Canada, especially Canada. Canada, in the post-war decades, made a series of rational, understandable, and in retrospect, quite consequential decisions to orient its economy toward the American market. Geography encouraged it. Proximity encouraged it. The sheer gravitational pull of American consumer demand encouraged it. By the time the Free Trade Agreement was signed in 1988, later expanded into NAFTA in 1994, Canada and the United States had become so economically intertwined that the relationship was less a partnership between two sovereign nations and more a single integrated production system that happened to straddle an international border. 75% of Canadian exports went to the United States. In some provinces, the figure was even higher. That is not trade. That is dependency, and both sides knew it, but only one side seemed to think about what it meant. Here is the historical parallel that I keep coming back to because I think it illuminates the current moment with uncomfortable precision. In the 1970s, the world got a crash course in what happens when a resource-rich group of nations decides to use that resource as a geopolitical instrument. OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, had been treated for most of its existence up to that point as a convenient supplier. The Western industrialized world ran on oil. It knew it ran on oil, and it had constructed a kind of comfortable myth that the oil would always be there, always be accessible, always be priced in a way that kept the engines of Western prosperity humming. That myth collapsed in October 1973 with the Arab oil embargo, and nothing about the global energy order was ever quite the same again. Now, I am not saying Canada is about to form a potash cartel and cut off American agriculture. That is not what is happening here, and I want to be precise about that because precision matters. But the structural parallel is striking enough to deserve serious attention. In both cases, you have a resource that the United States requires for its fundamental economic functioning. In both cases, that resource is heavily concentrated in a small number of places, and the United States does not control those places. In both cases, the country that does control those places has, for a long period of time, been treated as a passive supplier rather than a strategic actor. And in both cases, the moment of reckoning comes not because the supplier suddenly became hostile, but because the consumer's behavior, its arrogance, its assumptions, its willingness to treat economic relationships as one-way streets, finally pushed the supplier past a threshold of patience. The difference, and this is crucial, is that OPEC was a coalition of nations with adversarial histories and complicated internal politics that made sustained coordination difficult. Canada is a single, highly organized, politically sophisticated liberal democracy with a permanent professional civil service, deep institutional memory, and a government that is, at this particular moment, very clearly in the process of a strategic reassessment. That makes Canada, in some ways, a more formidable counterpart than OPEC ever was. Not more aggressive, not more hostile, more coherent, more capable of sustained, disciplined, strategic action. And that is a very different kind of challenge. The potash question has been building in Canadian policy circles for longer than most American observers realize. The Saskatchewan deposits have been known and mapped for decades. The Canpotex Export Consortium, the marketing arm through which Saskatchewan's major potash producers have historically sold abroad, has been operating since 1972. Canada has always known what it had. The question has always been whether it was willing to treat it as a strategic asset rather than just a commodity to be sold at market rates. And for most of that time, the answer was functionally no, not because Canada lacked the capability, but because the relationship with the United States felt stable enough, beneficial enough, that there was no compelling reason to rock the boat. What changed? Several things changed, and they changed more or less simultaneously, which is why the current moment feels different in kind rather than just in degree. The first thing that changed is the trade relationship itself. The imposition of tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, agricultural products, by an American administration that explicitly framed Canada as an economic adversary rather than a partner, sent a signal through the Canadian policy establishment that reverberated far beyond the specific sectors affected. It was not just the economic impact of the tariffs, though that was real and significant. It was the rhetorical framing. When the leader of the United States stands at a podium and describes Canada as a national security threat that lands differently than a negotiating tactic, it lands as a statement about how the relationship is understood. And Canada heard it. Canada is still hearing it. The second thing that changed is the global agricultural landscape. The war in Ukraine, which removed one of the world's largest potash exporters, Belarus's Belaruskali, from Western supply chains through sanctions and disrupted Ukrainian agricultural output on a massive scale, fundamentally altered the supply-demand calculus for agricultural inputs worldwide. Fertilizer prices spiked to historic highs. Countries that had been comfortably sourcing their potash from multiple suppliers suddenly found their supply chains disrupted, their budgets strained, and their food security assumptions challenged in real time. Into that environment, Canadian potash, already the world's largest reserve, already the most politically stable source, became not just valuable but strategically indispensable in a way it had never quite been before. And here's where it gets interesting, because this is the part that Washington has been slow to fully reckon with. When global demand for Canadian potash surged, Canada did not simply respond as a passive market actor, maximizing short-term revenue and moving on. It responded as a country that was, for the first time in a very deliberate and systematic way, thinking about what it wanted in return for its resources, not just in dollars, in relationships, in market diversification, in strategic positioning that would reduce its own historical overdependence on the United States. The potash move is not just a revenue decision, it is a hedge. It is Canada, with great professionalism and almost no drama, quietly building the geopolitical infrastructure for a future in which the United States is a significant customer, but no longer the only customer that matters. That distinction between dominant customer and indispensable customer is the entire ball game here. And the more Canada develops its relationships with Asian markets, with European buyers, with the emerging agricultural economies of the global South, the more that distinction solidifies in Canada's favor. The leverage only grows. the American position only weakens, and the window in which Washington could have addressed this through normal diplomatic and economic means could have reaffirmed the partnership, reinforced the relationship, given Canada reason to remain deeply and preferentially oriented toward American markets. That window did not close overnight. It has been closing slowly, steadily, and with gathering speed for years. And what happened next, the specific sequence of decisions and signals and strategic maneuvers that brought us to the $2 trillion reckoning, is the part they really didn't expect anyone to notice. Let's talk about what the actual mechanism looks like, because this is the part of the story where the abstract becomes concrete, where the geopolitical analysis meets the operational reality, and where the scale of what Canada is doing becomes genuinely difficult to overstate. We have established what potash is and why it matters. We have established the historical context that made this moment possible. Now, I want to walk you through what is actually happening, the specific moves, the specific actors, the specific decisions that are turning Canada's geological inheritance into a coordinated instrument of economic statecraft. And I want to do that because I think when you see it laid out in sequence, it becomes clear that this is not improvisation. This is not a reaction. This is a strategy that has been in development for a considerable period of time, and it is now moving into its execution phase. Start with Saskatchewan, because that is where the geology lives, and therefore where the power lives. The province sits atop roughly 4.5 billion tons of recoverable potash reserves. To put that in perspective, the next largest national reserve in the world, Russia's, is less than half that size. Kazakhstan is third. The entire rest of the world combined does not match what Saskatchewan has beneath its prairie topsoil. This is not a competitive advantage. This is a monopoly position dressed up in the polite language of market economics. And the two companies that dominate extraction from those reserves, Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer, and Mosaic, the second largest, are both headquartered in Canada, both deeply integrated into Canadian provincial and federal policy networks, and both are now operating inside a strategic environment that has changed fundamentally from the one they were built for. Nutrien alone has the production capacity to supply roughly 20% of global potash demand. Let me say that again because I think it needs a moment to settle. One company headquartered in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, can on its own supply 1/5 of everything the world needs in terms of this particular nutrient. That is an extraordinary concentration of supply-side power, and for most of Nutrien's existence, it was formed in 2018 through the merger of Potash Corp and Agrium. It has operated primarily as a commercial entity, optimizing for shareholder returns, managing its production levels to maintain favorable global pricing, and keeping a relatively low political profile. That posture is changing, not dramatically, not overnight, but in ways that are unmistakable to anyone watching the intersection of Canadian resource policy and Canadian foreign policy with any degree of attention. The federal government in Ottawa has been signaling through a series of policy documents, investment announcements, and diplomatic positioning that it views the potash sector not merely as a source of tax revenue and export earnings, but as a strategic national asset in the same category as energy infrastructure or telecommunications, the kind of sector where national interest considerations appropriately override pure market logic. The Critical Minerals Strategy published by Natural Resources Canada explicitly frames potash in this context. The language in that document is careful and bureaucratic, as government documents tend to be, but the underlying message is clear if you know how to read it. Canada is no longer going to simply let the market determine how its most strategically significant mineral resources are deployed. There is going to be a national interest overlay. And that overlay is going to be shaped, at least in part, by how Canada's trading relationships are functioning.